Hello students, my name is Niharika and today we'll be talking about the cardiac cycle. So in your previous lectures, you must have studied about the structure of the heart, right? So today let's study about the working of the heart. Now when I say working of the heart, what does it actually mean? Before that, let us talk about the heartbeat. So one heartbeat, students, consists of one systole. Now systole means contraction of the heart and diastole means relaxation of the heart. So one heartbeat actually consists of your heart contracting once and relaxing once. Then what is the meaning of cardiac cycle? One heartbeat actually comprises of one cardiac cycle. And you may ask that what is the duration of this one cardiac cycle? So students, you will be shocked to know that the duration of one cardiac cycle is around 0.8 seconds. That is not even one whole second, guys. So 0.8 seconds is the duration of one whole cardiac cycle. So let us now go forward and study about the various stages of cardiac cycle. Now when you talk about the various stages, the very first stage is called as the joint diastole. The joint diastole, as you can see, lasts for 0.4 seconds. If I am saying that the cardiac cycle is lasting for 0.8 seconds, that means half of your cardiac cycle is nothing but the joint diastole. So in joint diastole, all your four chambers, that is the two atria and the two ventricles, are relaxing. Next, let us move on to the atrial systole. Atrial systole is the stage wherein both the atria are simultaneously going to contract. You remember, right? Systole means contraction. So atrial systole lasts for 0.1 second only. Next, moving on to the last stage of the cardiac cycle, which is the ventricular systole. Again, systole means contraction. And when I'm saying ventricular systole, that means both your ventricles are contracting simultaneously. And that stage is lasting for 0.3 seconds. So let us confirm now what all other stages. Out of the entire 0.8 seconds cardiac cycle, your half cardiac cycle is joint diastole, that is 0.4 seconds. 0.1 seconds is your atrial systole, wherein your atria contract, and your ventricular systole lasts for 0.3 seconds. Now students, let us start with the very first stage, which is the joint diastole. The joint diastole, which is for 0.4 seconds, correct? During the joint diastole, all your four chambers are relaxed. Now, when I'm saying relaxed, does that mean that they're not doing any kind of work? They're just sitting like that? It's not the case. So, when I'm saying that all four chambers are relaxed, let us go back and see which chamber is filled with which kind of blood. That will help you to understand this stage better. Now, if you remember, your right atrium is filled with deoxygenated blood from superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus, which is carrying deoxygenated blood from the heart itself. So during joint diastole, right atrium is getting filled with deoxygenated blood. Remember students, none of the chambers are going to contract during this stage. What about the left atrium? The left atrium is going to get filled with oxygenated blood. Where is this oxygenated blood coming from? It is coming from the lungs via the pulmonary vein. So left atrium getting filled with oxygenated blood, right atrium getting filled with deoxygenated blood. That is the only activity going on in the atria. What about the ventricles now? If you remember that between the atrium and the ventricles, there is a valve called as the tri and bicuspid valve. Students, do you remember between which atria and ventricle is the tricuspid valve located? Can you tell me? Yes, it is the right atrium and the right ventricle between which your tricuspid valve is located. And the bicuspid valve, also called as the mitral valve, is located between the left atrium and left ventricle. Now students, the tri and the bicuspid valve both are going to be open. Both are going to be open during the joint diastole. Once your atrias are filled completely, see, the thing you have to remember is that during joint diastole, 100% atrias are filled, completely filled. Once they are completely filled, the pressure in the atrias builds up so much that the tri and bicuspid valve will open. And what happens next? 70%. Now this is very, very important. 70% of the blood goes from the atrias into the respective ventricles. यानी कि क्या होगा उसमें, आपके राइट एट्रियम से ब्लड राइट वेंट्रिकल में जाएगा और लेफ्ट एट्रिया से लेफ्ट वेंट्रिकल में जाएगा. सो 70% ऑफ योर ब्लड इज गोइंग फ्रॉम एट्रियास टू वेंट्रिकल्स. 30% blood is still remaining. Now moving on to the next stage of the cardiac cycle, which is the atrial systole. Now, as I've already told you, atrial systole lasts for a mere 0.1 seconds only. What happens during atrial systole? So during atrial systole, the sinoatrial node, SA node, or the sinoatrial node generates an action potential. Now, when the sinoatrial node generates an action potential, there is depolarization of both the atrias. When I say depolarization, you need to understand that depolarization is not the same as contraction. When both the atrias are depolarized, that leads to contraction of both the atrias, and both the atrias are going to contract simultaneously during atrial systole. Now, once they contract, you have to remember, in joint diastole, only 70% of the blood had gone from the atrias to the ventricles. Now, remaining 30%, when is that blood going to go into the ventricles? That is going to happen during the atrial systole. So, when the atrias are contracting, remember that the tri and bicuspid valves are still open. Otherwise, how would the blood flow from atrias to ventricles? So the remaining 30% blood, guys, remember, this is a line from NCERT which you have to remember. The remaining 30% blood from the atrias flows into the ventricles. So with atrial systole, your atrias are now completely empty and the ventricles have been filled completely. So if there's a question which asks you, when do both the atrias get completely filled? Your answer is joint diastole. As we have seen that both the atrias are completely filled during joint diastole. But if the question is, when are the ventricles filled 100%? 70% happened during joint diastole and the remaining 30% happened during atrial systole. So the answer to when do ventricles get filled 100%, the answer is during atrial systole. Now let me tell you about an important term which is called as the end diastolic volume. End diastolic volume is the volume in both the ventricles at the end of ventricular diastole. Joint diastole, ventricles were relaxing. Atrial systole, also ventricles were relaxing. So by the end of the ventricular diastole, that is ventricular relaxation, how much blood is there in each ventricle? That is about 130 ml in each ventricle, and that is called as the end diastolic volume. Similarly, we will also have an end systolic volume, and when you subtract these two values, you will get what is called as the stroke volume. Now let us move on to the ventricular systole, which is the last stage of cardiac cycle and lasts for 0.3 seconds. Now, what is exactly happening during the ventricular systole? Atrias, first of all, are now going to relax. Joint diastole, atria, ventricle, both were relaxing. Atrial systole, atrias were contracting, ventricles were relaxing. And now during ventricular systole, ventricles are going to contract and atrias are going to relax. That means they are going to undergo the atrial diastole. Now, ventricles are 100% filled. I had already told you that during atrial systole, ventricles have been 100% filled. अब ventricles 100% fill हो चुके हैं, अब क्या होने वाला है? Now, atrioventricular node, which is also called as the AV node, जैसे ऐसे नोड है जिसके वजह से तुम्हारे atrias contract करते हैं. Similarly, there is the AV node which leads to the contraction of the ventricles. Now AV node will send impulse to the ventricles, due to which both the ventricles are going to contract. Again, simultaneously they are going to contract. When the ventricles are contracting, see now what is happening, the blood has completely filled the ventricles. तो अब ventricles के अंदर का pressure बढ़ते जा रहा है. So right now what is going to happen, अभी तक जो walls बंद थे जिनके बारे में हमने कोई जिक्र नहीं किया था अभी तक, those were the semi-lunar walls. Semi-lunar walls are now going to open. Why are they opening? Because of the rising pressure of the blood in the ventricles, the semilunar valves are now going to open. Now when we're talking about the semilunar valves, where are they exactly present? The semilunar valves are present at the opening of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So at the opening of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, your semilunar valves are present. Tri and bicuspid valves, remember, they are going to close during ventricular systole. Joint diastole, they were open. Atrial systole, they were open. Now, why are they closing during ventricular systole? See, remember that valves have a role in preventing backflow of the blood. Valves prevent backflow of the blood back into the atria. So tri and bicuspid valves are closing during ventricular systole because at this moment both the ventricles are filled completely with blood. If these valves don't close up, immediately the blood will flow back into the atria and that is going to lead to a problem. So in order to prevent the backflow of blood, tri and bicuspid valves close. This is important, so I am putting a star mark over here. Now once these valves close, the ventricular pressure is increasing within the ventricles due to the blood. The pressure has increased. Semilunar valves have now been opened. Once the semilunar valves are open, the blood will flow from the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk. And do we remember what kind of a blood is this? Is this deoxygenated blood or oxygenated blood, students? Remember, right ventricle has deoxygenated blood. So deoxygenated blood from right ventricle flows into the pulmonary trunk. And similarly, from the left ventricle, the blood flows into the aorta. Now, which kind of a blood is this? This is the oxygenated blood from left ventricle to the aorta. Now, what has happened? Ventricles are empty. Mind you, they don't become completely empty. Some amount of blood is still remaining in the ventricles even at the end of the ventricular systole. So ventricles are now relaxed. They have finished contracting. The contraction was due to the AV node, if you remember. They have finished relaxing. Pressure has come down a bit. And now the semilunar valves are going to close. बिकॉज जितना ब्लड जाना था राइट वेंट्रिकल और लेफ्ट वेंट्रिकल से वो ऑलरेडी जा चुका है, तो सेमिलुनार वाल्व के खुले होने का अभी कोई मतलब नहीं है. दैट इज व्हाई सेमिलुनार वाल्व्स आर नाउ क्लोजिंग. व्हेन आर सेमिलुनार वाल्व्स क्लोजिंग? At the end of the ventricular systole. During ventricular systole, these valves are open, and at the end of the ventricular systole, the semilunar valves are going to close. Meanwhile, what is happening? The atrias are again going to get filled. Now, like how I told you during joint diastole, अब atrias दोबारा भरने जा रहे हैं. राइट एट्रिया में आपका डीऑक्सीजनेटेड ब्लड आ रहा है और लेफ्ट एट्रियम में आपका आ रहा है ऑक्सीजनेटेड ब्लड. So atrias are getting filled again. AV valves यानी कि आपके ट्राई और बाइकस्पिड वाल्व्स जो हैं वो अब फिर से खुलने वाले हैं बिकॉज अगेन अ न्यू कार्डियक साइकिल इज गोइंग टू बिगिन. ये वाला कार्डियक साइकिल खत्म हो चुका है, 0.8 सेकेंड्स खत्म हो चुके हैं, नया कार्डियक साइकिल अब चालू हो जाएगा. Remember how we spoke about the end diastolic volume? I told you, remember? Now there is similarly an end systolic volume as well. What is end systolic volume? Amount of blood in each ventricle at the end of the ventricular systole. End diastolic volume क्या था? Amount of blood in each ventricle at the end of ventricular diastole. मतलब ventricles relax हो जाए उसके end में कितना blood था? 130 ml per ventricle. अब वेंट्रिकल्स कॉन्ट्रैक्ट हो चुके हैं, फिर भी मैंने बोला कंप्लीटली खाली नहीं है, कुछ अमाउंट ऑफ ब्लड अभी भी भरा है उसमें. वो वॉल्यूम है एन सिस्टोलिक वॉल्यूम, और वो वॉल्यूम कितना है 60 ml पर वेंट्रिकल. Now, what is the significance of these two volumes, the end diastolic volume and the end systolic volume? Let us see. The significance is that when you talk about the end diastolic volume कितना था? It was about 130 ml. End systolic volume कितना है? It is about 60 ml. So end systolic volume. So if you subtract the end systolic volume minus the end diastolic volume, तुम्हें मिलेगा लगभग 70 ml of blood, and this 70 ml is nothing but your stroke volume. So what is the definition of stroke volume? The amount of blood each ventricle pumps during one cardiac cycle, वो है आपका stroke volume. How do you calculate it? End diastolic volume minus end systolic volume, which is 130 minus 60, approximately 70 ml is your stroke volume. So these are the details about your cardiac cycle. Thank you so much.